Sure. Can you give a massive welcome to the Babel Bar stage, please, to Phil Howes?
Good evening. This is me, and that's the title of my story tonight. And just to let you know that the genesis of this story started with an article I read in a newspaper last year. And it said how to sell a child in the UK. And that really got me thinking. And I went a bit of research and looked at my own personal things, and the result is this story. And I'd like to give you a little preview. Okay. Maybe not. Okay. Great. Thanks, Tim. So here's the preview. In terms of as much change as there is and nothing changes, at the top is then. That's where I'm going to start in Victorian times. And the now, which is today, I'm going to use the Emirates of Abu Dhabi. And as I go through the story, we're hopefully going to include a few vignettes and even a lad from Salford. That's not a bad term to use. Yellow Wellingtons. I'm going to bring in a 1960s TV, a fort, a power station, the Sun newspaper, a broken clock, and the Emirates of Abu Dhabi. And as we go along, I'm also going to have a little chat about scandals. And it must never happen again. And really have a look at, why does it always happen again? Why does it never change? And one of the culprits is public inquiries. Yeah? But the main culprit we'll be talking about tonight is the blame culture. So, let's get started with Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, she was just a representative of the royal family, a continuation, along with the empire. But she also reigned during that massive period of change called the Industrial Revolution. And during that period, childhood changed quite drastically. Children might work in the mines from age 6 upwards. They might, like this group of lads here, have been sold to the local chimney sweep. Another child might be working in the mills. And further, there might be a mother and a daughter working in a factory up in Manchester. And really, during that period, children were turned into commodities, and childhood was never the same again. And my next slide is really my first vignette, a pair of yellow Wellingtons. So where does that going to take me? Well, let me tell you. It's going to have a look at government, and it's going to look at parenting and the role of women in society. And to help me do that, I'm going to turn to this man here. You may have heard of Konrad Lorenz. He was Austrian, he was a zoologist, and he was doing research at the beginning of the 20th century. And he was looking at the mechanics of imprinting, where certain animals and birds were able to make a permanent attachment to the first large moving object that they saw when they came out of the egg. And in this case, him and his researchers wore yellow Wellingtons. And what he discovered was that they were actually grey-lag geese, and they followed him and his researchers about like their parents, and which came up with the idea of imprinting. And a big fan of Konrad Lorenz was an English psychologist and psychiatrist, John Bowlby. And he wondered if this had anything to do with human beings as well, whether it transferred. And he developed the idea of attachment theory. And what he discovered was that, what he said was that maternal deprivation in a child's early life caused permanent emotional damage. Specifically, he said, if a child doesn't bond within the first 2 years, it can result in quite serious mental health problems. And the government incorporated his research into the Children Act in 1948. And came up with the idea of parental responsibility and the importance of the mother in terms of caring after the child. Now, the government were really keen on this piece of research. And I had to ask myself, why were they so keen on it? Did I mention the Second World War? You will remember that most men went off to fight the war, and women went to work on farms and in factories to keep the country going. And the government's idea was, well, this will be straightforward. There won't want any change. Once the war finished, it was like, well, the men, we want them to come back, take over the jobs again. You women, please just go home. It didn't matter that the women were really successful in keeping the country going and doing what they did. And they gained, I think, a true independence, both financially and otherwise, in the jobs that they were doing. But the government prevailed and actually got women to return to the home. I mentioned in the prelude, scandal, and this phrase. You must have heard it every time there's a scandal. One of the newspapers or someone somewhere will say, well, it must never happen again. And that then becomes the reason for a public inquiry. And it's never been truer than in the child protection services, that we've had lots and lots of public inquiries. And really, we're still getting them. It doesn't seem to be able to change. And I'm going to suggest that one reason is to do with individual human beings. And that's all of us. That's me, you, and all the people in the audience. And I'm just going to return to Konrad Lorenz, whose other research, he was suggesting that aggression is hardwired into the human psyche. And a really great friend of mine, Dr. Colin Hawkes, he worked for the NSPCC, and he also worked for the probation service, and strangely enough, for Strangeways Prison. And he worked with not only people who had been abused, but he also worked with people who abused other people. And in his staff development sessions, he had this really brilliant way of taking people along with him about the understanding of child protection and abuse. And for that, he used the 1960s TV. And what he said was, well, when we bought a TV in the 60s, no one really knew how it worked. If it went wrong, you certainly couldn't repair it. So you learnt various things to make it work. You knew to plug it in, to switch it on. You had a knob there to change the channel. There was another one for the volume. And if you couldn't get a good picture, you could fiddle around with the aerial. And let me tell you, you didn't need to go to the gym in those days. You got enough exercise, getting up from your couch and going to the TV just to do those things. And then he introduced the idea, well, that's the TV, and the fact that we don't really understand how it works. What about the newborn child? How much do parents know about how a newborn child works? I'll hold my hand up and say, no, I didn't have a lot to understand. What you quickly understand, though, is the child has two main ways of communicating. One is by smiling and giggling, and the other one is by crying. And you fairly quickly pick up the cry that means, I want to be fed, or the one that says, I need to be changed, or the one that says, I need to be cuddled. And we find ways of actually beginning to understand what the child's needs are. And if we go back to the TV, Colin would take the back to the TV, and he would say, yeah, but what if all the things you knew about getting the TV to work didn't work? The TV would not work. And he said, very often people will return to the default position of aggression being hardwired. I've gone the wrong way. And they would hit the TV or they would shake it. Let's move to the young baby, to the child. Do you see where I'm going on this? And this is where Colin took it. This inbuilt aggression could often end up in abuse. And his big message was that really, when parents are thought to have abused children, very often it's just the parent not understanding the child's behaviour. Another way, another reason for such things about what stops change taking place might be the stages of life. You can find lots of different ways of describing the life cycle, but a tutor when I was up in Salford gave this, and it really stuck with me. And he said, when you're a child, it's the period of why. You're seeking knowledge. You're trying to find stuff out. Why is this? Why is that? And as we move to adolescence, teenagers, and young adulthood, We say, well, I've got some knowledge now, but why can't we do it this way? Why do we have to do that? We could find a new way of dealing with stuff. And of course, when we get older and you get to my age and you're retired, you just say, we can't do that because, we just follow the rules and regulations. And in fact, I know from talking to my friend who's in the audience somewhere, when we meet up, we're often saying, do you remember the good old days? Yeah? And this is this idea that things were better way, way, way back in the past. And I just want to have a look at, take you through some resistance to change within various organisations and corporal punishment. Do any of you know? Let me just go find it. Any of you know when corporal punishment was banished in schools? Yeah, I must learn this for next time. Right, here we go. Right, so there it is, 1986. And when was it banned in private schools? 1999. It took a long time for the change to take place. And I think so in terms of change and corporal punishment, I will make one thing. They say, why do organisations resist change? What is it that organisations fear? I'd like to suggest in part it's their survival, in part it's their loss of control and authority, and in part it's the fact that they might be feeling stupid about stuff. And I can certainly remember Mr. Miller, who was my deputy head back in the 60s, and I think for him, and regarding corporal punishment, change was like FOMO, F-O-M-O, the fear of missing out. And the thing he didn't want to miss out on was what to him was the happiest part of his duties, and that was getting his slipper out and giving the kids a good slap. Which takes me on to the blame culture. Or as Shaggy would say, it wasn't me, it was him. And there's a number of public investigations. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but the police and the Hillsborough disaster, where it took them 28 years before they admitted it wasn't drunken Liverpool fans who caused the problems, it was them who opened the gates at the wrong time. You will know of all the public inquiries, all the scandals with the church, and of course it led to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, resigning. The health service also has its problems, and I would cite the 1970s infected blood scandal, where people receiving blood transfusions developed hepatitis and AIDS simply because the blood hadn't been checked before. It was brought in from abroad, it wasn't checked beforehand. The Home Office, also, the hostile environment created during 2012 and 17, and the Windrush scandal. And finally, the Post Office, where even though they knew that the problem was with the computers and Fujitsu, they actually took 700 people to court where they were convicted and some were imprisoned, and that's still ongoing. Now, I usually go through these slides of my presentation with Margaret, my wife, before I come. And I got to this point and she said, "It's a bit grim, Phil. You've really got to cheer up a bit." So I thought, right, I know what I'll do. So I'm going to lighten things up a bit here. And that's a power station, a nuclear power station. I'm back in 1979 at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. All hell broke loose one night and it went into near meltdown. And the first inquiry came back and said, blame the staff. They didn't act quick enough. But let me take you into the control room at 3 Mile Island. There it is. Each of the circuits had a safety system, and it showed up usually as a light. And if something went wrong, it came on red. And what happened on the night in question was every safety light came on at the same time. And the second inquiry was obliged to actually accept that the staff were okay. What happened is that they were never trained and told, when all the lights come on, which is the first lights you attend to first. Yeah? They didn't know what the priority was. And in fact, I was really pleased to work with this person here, Professor Eileen Monroe, in 2001 when I was in a London borough. And she came in to provide some training for us. She had actually looked at a number of public inquiries and investigations, and she came up with these findings. She said, first of all, public inquiries, they don't look to change things. What they look to do is find an individual or individuals to blame. And they stop, as soon as they get that, they stop. They don't look at any systematic changes or anything to do with it. And what they do is then, from the public inquiry, they put a load of recommendations up. And they say, we must increase control over the frontline staff. And we must do that by issuing ever more guidance and standardised practice. And the net result is that people at the front line, and I'll use social workers because that's where I used to work, staff judgments and discretion become to be marginalised and became less important to following the procedures and the guidance. And she talked about unintended consequences of such inquiries. And I love this cartoon of Calvin and Hobbes. Here's Calvin, he's got a fly in the house. He eventually catches it, he doesn't kill it. He wants to let it out of the house so it can live on. And he walks back into the house with a rather smug smile on his face, thinking he's solved the problem. But if you look at the top of the screen, his problem has just increased by 300%. Because 3 more flies have thrown in while he's been putting one out. And in some ways, that's exactly what's happened at the front line of many workers. If we take social workers, whose main job was to support and provide help for, shall we say, somewhat dysfunctional families like the Simpsons. And when every public inquiry looked to just find someone to blame, many workers moved from risk management to risk aversion and to looking after themselves. So they would look at the guidance, and they'd start to say, well, this is what I'm doing, because if I do this, it doesn't matter if something goes wrong, they won't be able to blame me. And I talked about government guidance and ever more guidance being issued. Just to give you an idea, in 1974, the child protection guidance was 7 pages. And by 2010, it was 424 pages. And this was the effect. It absolutely overwhelmed workers. And workers started to find a way around this because they couldn't cope. And so developed the tick box culture, which moved them away from their focus of providing support to families. Okay. Bills remaining. What's happening here? Right, okay. I'm going to take you straight now to 2008 and the review of Baby P, the child who died. The Sun newspaper ran headlines about it's not enough blood on their hands. These workers have got to go now. And this went on for several days. And in fact, what they did was they actually started a petition to sack the staff. Ed Balls, he was being interviewed on TV. And without planning it, he actually asked, he said he was going to tell Haringey to sack the head of education and children's services. The unintended consequences, immediately after the review was released, child protection referrals went through the roof. And if we go back to, and that was people in health, police, education, they were making referrals. So instead of maybe 10 referrals a week, there were 50 child protection referrals a week. And going back to Arlene Munro and 3 Mile Island about priority, when everything is a priority, absolutely nothing is a priority, and it stops progress being made. And this takes me on to, I quite like this slide, the broken clock, which is always right at least twice a day. So who's got the honour of gaining this accolade tonight? Well, it was 2010, and it was the new Secretary of State for Education. Guesses? It was, here he is, Michael Gove. And what Michael Gove did, in my opinion, was one of the best things he ever did. He asked Professor Arlene Munro to complete a review of England's child protection system. But critically, he asked her to find out what helped or hindered professionals from making well-informed judgments and interventions. And the important part about this, he was really saying to Arlene Munro, don't just stop when you found the member of staff to blame. Look at why the staff failed to act on this. And this was, he was asking her to look for, what was the workload like? What was the training? Did they receive the training? Was there enough support? Was there enough resources? And were the staffing levels okay? And of course, that would have been absolutely great, except that we then had 14 years of austerity, where local authorities had their money reduced every year for that period of time. And I'm afraid that Professor Eileen Munro's work has, to all intents and purposes, disappeared. There's been some changes, but it's really remained as it is. And I come back to the start of my talk. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Economic progress, poverty, exploitation. The gap between rich and poor grows wider. With the drive for material and commercial success, there appears a kind of moral decay in society. And the exchange of children for profit is normalized. What am I describing? What era would you say I'm describing? Well, I can tell you that's in Wikipedia, and that refers to the Victorian era. I would suggest it may even apply today, which takes us to the Emirates of Abu Dhabi. Here we go. 36% of children who are looked after in foster care, 36% is now provided by private agencies. 83% of children in residential care provided by profit-making corporations, private equity, venture capital. What on earth has happened here? Okay, bills remaining 5. Right, okay. It's disappeared. I can do this from memory. This is a game of Jeopardy. I'm going to give you the answer. I invite you to tell me what the question is. £4,000 per week, £200,000 per year. Well, the question might be, what's the average cost of a child in care to a local authority? £4,000 a week. If I say £53,000, what might be the question? Well, the question might be, how much will it cost me to send my child to Eton College? 19% to 27%. Well, the question might be, what's the average level of net profit that the Emirates of Abu Dhabi and Qatar make from providing schools for children with special educational needs? And my final number is £910. Well, the question might be, how much profit does each child in care generate each week for private companies? I'm just getting back. Oh yeah, so I want to finish on a personal story. Back in 1970, I'd been working in the civil service, but in 70 I thought I needed a change. And I applied for and got a job in Brighton as the head of a working boys hostel. I had no previous experience and no previous training, but I got the job. And what I took down with me was my own childhood experience in an industrial landscape of Salford, whereby I played around on fields, disused factories, canals, railway lines, call it what you will. But I took that sense of adventure down to Brighton, along with my knowledge of Enid Blyton, the famous 5 and the secret 7. And I went down there not knowing really what I was doing. I mean, this was in my why not stage, where it was just, well, why not give it a try? And I decided that what I would do is with the young men, instead of me telling them what I wanted them to do, I'd say, okay, what do you want to do? These were young men who were living on the edge of society. They didn't live at home. They might have not been going to school. And I just listened. I said, well, okay, what do you want to do? I'm not so sure I should have asked that question. But I ended up here. Anyone know where this is? Yes, this was known in 70s Fort Encantada. It was well derelict and disused. It's now open again as New Haven Fort. But one of the lads said, let's go down there, Phil. It's really great down there. And we spent several days down there over the 2 years I was there. And we actually, what we did was, we managed to dig stuff out. Forgive me. Right. And we discovered tunnels. And on one occasion, we turned out about halfway down the cliff face. Another time, see the building at the bottom there? The tunnel took us right down to the building. The kids loved it, and I must admit, so did I. And just to finish on the continuing adventures of Phil and the famous five, I've told you about New Haven Fort. We also built furniture that they could take with them when they moved on. We also renovated a beach hut under the top promenade, under the Grand Hotel. And we built a raft one summer and took that out. It was absolutely brilliant times. And the pinnacle came in 1972, the Arc de Triomphe, when myself and 5 of those young men went to Belgium, and we went to Paris for a day trip. I don't know if you can tell which is me. Okay, second from the left. And this was Stuart. At the other side of me, Lawrence, Stephen, and Jack. And really what pleased me most was that, and what I learned down in Brighton, was 2 things. One was, rules and regulations are fine, we do need them, and you need to be trained, and you need knowledge. But what you also need to understand is that it doesn't matter how many procedures are written and guidance, it will never cover every eventuality. And sometimes you have to work and make decisions on the spot, which I found myself doing because I had no previous experience in Brighton. And I think that's it. And with that, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Phil Howes, thank you so much.